Begin reading the paper, I guess I should make two remarks. The the first remark is somewhat autobiographical. One of the things that I perhaps missed most in my youth was what some psychologists like to call an identity crisis. And it was for this reason, among other things, that I never felt much sympathy to existentialism, because the first time I read Camus' The Stranger, I really thought that the stranger was a little nuts, and I was never able to conclude whether my lack of an identity crisis was an indication of my normality, whether I was so well adjusted that I never had one, or whether I was just too insensitive to have one. In any case, I'm happy to report that the Summer Committee on Lectures has now precipitated at this late development in my life an identity crisis, since some of the announcements refer to me as Richard Hollinger, and some of the announcements refer to me as Robert Hollinger. And I suppose this is not the kind of identity crisis I had always hoped for, but in any case, my name is Robert and not Richard. Although perhaps there's some deep-rooted psychological reason for my being preoccupied with the topics of sex and semantics in this paper, which has something to do with my lack of identity crisis. I don't know. Secondly, I'd like to thank my colleagues Joe Kupfer and Lala O'Driscoll for making helpful comments on earlier versions of this paper, and also to the members of Dr. O'Driscoll's seminar on the philosophy of feminism, to which I read an earlier version of this paper in the spring, again for making very helpful comments on an earlier version of the paper. So here goes. In this discussion, I want to offer an answer to the question, what is the basic significance of the women's liberation movement? My answer, naturally enough, is predicated upon the assumption that it is to the philosophical dimensions of feminism that we must look for an answer. I mean by philosophical any conceptual issue relating to our most basic ways of understanding ourselves in the world, both physical and social, in which we live. Hence, my strategy in answering the question before us consists in an attempt to isolate those philosophical issues which feminism is speaking to, and see what solutions or proposals it has to offer about them. Needless to say, my discussion will be extremely cursory and superficial, owing, among other things, to limitations of time. In the course of my discussion, I will consider what seems to me a stumbling block in any effort to isolate, let alone evaluate putative answers to the question I am interested in. Roughly speaking, the stumbling block is the fact that there are two basic components of feminism as a movement, which I shall call the ideological and the philosophical components, respectively. This distinction is not meant to be disparaging or tendentious. Indeed, I think many of the ideological, I'm using ideological here to some extent in a non-Marxist sense. Indeed, I think many of the ideological or political goals and accomplishments of the feminist movement, for example, passage of the ERA activities on behalf of daycare centers, equality of duties and obligations between spouses, more psychologically and sexually enriching interpersonal relationships, etc., are extremely important for both men and women. By the same token, I do not assume that all philosophical dimensions of the movement are either defensible, worthwhile, or more important than the political goals in question. My basic reason for pursuing this distinction is itself mainly philosophical, although I do think it has some potentially practical implications if my thesis is correct. My thesis is this: there is at least a potential conflict between some of the ideological goals and position associated with feminism and some of what I take to be the basic philosophical goals of the movement. The sort of conflicts I have in mind fall under two broad headings. First, there are some ideological or political claims, goals, assertions, and assumptions which are either directly or indirectly logically incompatible with some of the philosophical assertions, assumptions, implications, and goals of the movement as I see it. By the way, although I speak of the movement in what follows, I fully realize that this is a gross distortion. Similarly, I do not mean to suggest that any particular person is guilty of any of the inconsistencies I will be discussing. Even so, I think the main point of this paper, which is really a friendly piece of advice, remains valid. Secondly, I believe that some of the ideological features of women's liberation movement would, if successful, undermine both the philosophical goals and assumptions of the movement, again as I interpret it, as well as some of the political and practical moral legitimacy which are used to justify these ideologically oriented activities. As you might expect from the title of my lecture, one source of these potential conflicts centers around the role and significance of issues relating to sexuality and language in both the ideological and philosophical phases of the movement. Another source of conflict, I think, centers around the tension between ideological or political demands to increase the political power and dominance of women in this society and the philosophical critique of the basic nature of our cultural model of our culture's model of human relationships, which is based upon the assumption that human beings are basically egotistical and domineering, so that interpersonal relationships such as marriage and political relationships on this view must be predicated upon power relationships and not on morality. I'll say more about this as I proceed. Although my main emphasis will be on the first locus of issues, that is concerning sexuality and language, I will intersperse remarks about the second set of issues throughout the paper, and will only focus on these issues after listing what I take to be the basic philosophical assumptions and goals of feminism viewed philosophically. In thinking about the philosophical and cultural significance of the feminist movement, one is immediately struck by the importance placed upon issues relating to sexuality and language. The first question I want to ask is this: do the issues just mentioned get to the heart of feminism, that's probably a mixed metaphor, but, or actually obscure the human significance of the movement? At first sight, it may seem almost fatuous to mention the crucial roles that language and sexuality play in the writings of the feminist movement. After all, the status of women in our culture is significantly related to certain sexual and linguistic practices and institutions. So the need to examine and, where required, criticize and alter these practices and institutions is an obvious first step in any liberation effort. Moreover, sexuality and language are arguably quite central to our self-understanding as persons, so that the themes in question enter into any discussion connected with the idea of a human being, and not just any discussion of women and their social status. I certainly do not wish to quarrel with these points, although it may be helpful to pin down both their specific importance for the feminist movement and their general human significance a bit more clearly. It strikes me that we ought to be on guard against overemphasizing the issues of sexuality and language, again, from a philosophical point of view, owing to the fact that these themes constitute paradigm cases of morality and immorality for the unreflective person, that is, for conventional moral wisdom. It therefore seems odd for a movement which claims to be based upon a reflective critique of conventional moral wisdom to agree with the assumptions behind unreflected morality, that is, that sexuality constitutes the essence of morality. To be sure, as a strategic move, that is, as part of the ideological or political dimension of the liberation movement, as a strategic move in bringing to light the prejudices of conventional morality and in developing a conceptual and social reevaluation of values, as well as for other reasons, for example, raising sensitivities of people who promote sexist practices, the wisdom of these developments cannot be doubted, although there are dangers even here. For example, I believe that too much attention on the issue of language promotes a kind of other directedness in ways which I'll mention a little bit more later. But it seems as if we have to distinguish between the strategic or the ideological and the philosophical wisdom and significance of emphasizing sexuality and language. It is my contention that the philosophical significance of feminism does not lie in the issues being discussed, even though these issues do point to more fundamental themes which ultimately relate feminism to basic philosophical concerns about the nature of persons in society. Now the first section here is called semantics. Maybe using the word semantics in a sloppy sense, but my learned colleague, Professor Galli, will tell me if I am. There can be little doubt that language plays a basic role in structuring our experience, including our self-understanding as persons. Hence, linguistic practices that condone the use of terms such as nigger, kike, broad, queer, etc., no doubt have adverse effects on how people think and act toward one another, and thus how they understand themselves. So we must act to eliminate such practices wherever we find them. But is this task, however important, anything more than a preliminary stage in a more fundamental project? I think not. In fact, I am inclined to think that overemphasizing semantic issues can lead to results which are themselves inimical to the progress of this more basic development toward liberation for all peoples, and women in particular. Dramatic pause. To set the stage for an elaboration of these remarks, let us begin with an analogous case. Suppose we ask how significant eliminating the word nigger from the language is for black liberationists. Again, distinguishing between the strategic and philosophical aspect of liberation movements, it seems clear that blacks are more concerned with issues concerning social justice, economic equality, educational opportunity, freedom of choice, etc., than they are with semantical issues, and rightly so, even if we recognize how people's beliefs and attitudes change when nigger is no longer tolerated, that is the word nigger. Similarly, eliminating words such as broad is apt to change our beliefs and attitudes regarding women. But focusing on semantic issues such as whether to use the word TEY and the word TEM and the word TER in place of he, him, and his, or whether to call a woman Ms. instead of Miss, etc., seems to channel the philosophical talent and creative energies of concerned people in the wrong direction. Indeed, several negative ramifications of this sort of development have not received sufficient attention in the literature concerned with feminism, although the general issues at stake are well-worn philosophical topics. I'm referring to the issues of conceptual and ethical relativism, which are associated with certain views about the importance of language in structuring and limiting human experience. I shall argue that many discussions about language in the feminist movement, particularly, or at least many of the ideological dimensions of the feminist movement, either presuppose or imply a commitment to one of the aforementioned doctrines, which makes such discussions objectionable on philosophical grounds. Someone's left out. But the view that language plays an important role in structuring our experience, including our self-understanding, and thus our practices, raises certain issues about the relationship between language and thought, more specifically about the relationship between language and conceptions such as truth, knowledge, and morality. One position on this cluster of issues often goes by the name of relativism. Relativism is the view that different languages or cultures carve up the world in different and equally arbitrary ways. One implication of this view is that each way of carving up things is as legitimate as any other. Indeed, each system of concepts provides the standards of legitimacy which alone can be used in evaluating those particular concepts and the practices and institutions they are embedded in. This is the kind of thing you get in Sumner's folkways, that custom is king. More specifically, truth, knowledge, and values are construed on this model in a relativistic manner, with results that I will sketch presently. Relativism is often associated with another view known as linguistic determinism. Sometimes these views are confused or conflated, but they are actually logically independent of each other. According to determinism, the language one uses makes one a prisoner, just as determinists in general, for example, economic determinists like Marx and cultural determinists like Skinner, hold that our behavior is influenced by factors outside our control. What we do, say, and experience, indeed what we can do, say, and experience, are determined by our language and culture. Hence, we bear no responsibility for what we do or don't say, do and don't express. A fortiori, we can't be held accountable for perpetuating objectionable or incorrect modes of belief, practices, or institutions, or be admonished to change them in any way according to determinist principles. Even if one waives the usual philosophical objections to this sort of view, the practical or ideological ramifications of accepting it are intolerable, I think, both in general and in connection with feminist issues. I rather doubt if anyone would accept this view if its implications were seen. Thus, presumably, we want to say that people shouldn't characterize women as broads, that it is wrong to do so, and that we ought to and therefore can change our practices. The fact that our culture may foster such practices is no excuse, much less a barrier to changing them. But for the views we are considering, that is, for the ideological views according to which people express objectionable characterizations of women by using sexist terminology, it seems impossible in principle to change them or to hold that they are incorrect or morally objectionable. That is, if the ideological critique of certain practices is based upon deterministic assumptions, which it often is, that is, that people are conditioned to be sexist and we have to condition them not to be, the moral leverage of such attacks is undercut, because on deterministic views, people aren't responsible for the beliefs they hold. Moreover, I take it that we would not hold that sexist ways of talking and acting are just as legitimate, although just as arbitrary, as linguistic practices which embody non-sexist assumptions and moral principles. In short, at least feminists are trying to criticize certain social practices on the grounds that they really are wrong. Yet all too often it seems as if the acceptance of relativism, which undercuts the possibility of such criticisms, is lurking in the background. But this is both inconsistent with the philosophical assumptions behind the feminist movement and strategically unsound. It's strategically unsound because what happens then is the question of right becomes the question of might, or the question as to who has the most political power to change existing practices. What is needed is a position which does not imply or presuppose just the sort of views, that is, determinism and relativism, which criticism of existing practices must reject out of hand. A number of further consequences of these two positions are worth noting. First, they often lead to a kind of moral indifferentism and what I would like to call a kind of false tolerance. On the assumption that all moral practices are arbitrary but legitimate within their own province, by fiat, all practices must be accepted as legitimate, indeed as definitive of morality within their domain. This nihilistic view actually embodies a conservative morality, that is, whatever is right. And again, you get this in relativists like Sumner, who argue in effect that custom is king. Or queen, maybe would be a more appropriate characterization. This nihilistic view actually embodies a conservative morality, together with the conceptual resources for making criticisms of existing practices incoherent. Since existing practices are moral by definition, any practices which don't conform to existing institutions is by definition immoral. Two familiar responses to this view are these. One, the belief that since another society might have a different definition of, say, cruelty, this thing. Oh yeah, one of the replies to this is that it may just be that different groups have different definitions. So, for example, what one group might call sexist, another group might not. And again, this will determine what is or is not sexist within the culture, or for those who use certain kinds of terminology. Now, I think this leads to moral indifferentism, because the logical implication of this is that the Nazis were merely using the word immoral in a different way than we do, and there was no substantive difference between Nazi morality and a morality which does not countenance genocide for political reasons. The second reply is that the belief that we must tolerate all existing moralities on pains of incoherence, moral imperialism, narrow ethnocentrism, etc. This reply leads to the so-called paradox of tolerance, which was articulated by Karl Popper in one of his books, or what I call false tolerance, that is, the tolerance of moralities which are themselves intolerant. I think, by the way, that the idea that social science is morally neutral is a species of this fallacy. In fact, most relativists are really ethical absolutists, which is one reason why most of them are intolerant, who hold that each culture or individual provides an absolute standard of reference by fiat. Now, surely no advocate of feminism, to take just this case alone, can accept these implications seriously without undermining the cogency and practical force of their critique of conventional sexual moral practices. Furthermore, communication and cross-cultural and interpersonal understanding and cooperation become difficult, if not impossible, on these two assumptions, that is, on the deterministic and the relativistic assumptions. The most extreme statement of this is the argument that concludes that only a black can understand the black, only a woman a woman. What does one say about a black woman? This argument actually leads to solipsism and to a social philosophy which treats individuals as natural antagonists and society as atomistic. I'll say more about this later when I talk about the political ideology of this movement. It also leads to Sartre's view that all relations between human beings are either masochistic, sadistic, or impossible. This alone should cause us to think twice about this view. Indeed, we can reduce this argument to absurdity and also see where it leads if we make it completely general. Since we are all unique in some ways, we can argue that no one can ever understand anyone else because no one can ever be anyone else. If this is true, how do we even know that people use words like nigger abroad are saying what they seem to be saying? That is, how can we be sure that our criticism of them are based upon a total misunderstanding of what they mean? We come full circle to relativism and determinism, which are totally useless in connection with criticism of existing practices. On these views, the idea of humanity as a regulative ideal for mutual understanding and moral interaction among people is lost. We virtually become individual species as different from each other as the ape differs from the amoeba. Even Marx, for whom determinism and the notions of ideology play such crucial roles, saw that it is impossible to reject this ideal without making his critique of ideology and oppression incoherent. That is, Marx even distinguishes between ideology and true morality in his philosophy. The core of the issues around that I'm discussing here center around an ancient controversy between nature and convention. While this dispute and the related distinctions between natural and unnatural and between normal and abnormal have not really been satisfactorily dealt with by anyone, it seems to me that we should reject a priori the extreme conventionalism which I have discussed above, that is, that questions about morality are purely conventional. Once this is done, perhaps more progress can be made on the important issues raised by the disputes I have just discussed. In general, I think that the problem here is one of giving an account of human behavior which takes account of the fact that human beings are both biological organisms and basically social animals. And again, I think this is one of the things that Marx is getting at in his discussion of species being in his, some of his writings. The second topic here is sexuality. I assume this is what you all have been waiting to listen to. Human sexuality is perhaps an even more basic dimension of personhood and language, and certainly it is no less important. I therefore will not deny the importance of recent discussions about good sex, bad sex, perverted sex, etc., or with efforts to get people to overcome their sexual hang-ups, improve their techniques, experiment with different positions, arrangements, and so on. In fact, I believe that discussions of sexual perversion and analogies between language and sex shed light on important issues. But these issues transcend questions about sexual practices and techniques per se, and focus on issues about what it is to be a person, what morality is, and how one's sexual practices are related to these central topics of concern. In short, the topic of sexuality can be divided into two separate, although related areas. First, there are issues about sexuality per se. that is, as a human activity. Such topics as sex roles, love and sex, sexual pleasure, etc. come in here. B, issues which raise more general issues, both about the meaning of human sexuality and about moral ideals of personhood and human relationships. Topics relating sex to these general ideals and to issues such as human dignity and autonomy, respect for persons, etc., are of primary concern here. My claim is that the basic philosophical significance of sexuality lies within Area B. For the issues raised here transcend man-woman relationships and questions about sexuality as an activity, and thus suggest one of the ways in which the feminist movement is concerned with quite general themes about persons and their interactions. I do not want to leave the impression that the issues raised under A aren't important both philosophically and practically. At the same time, it can be argued that even the issues dealt with here, that is, issues concerning sexuality per se, are of general significance and not merely of significance to the specific plight of women. For example, questions about sex roles and questions about orgasms, coital positions, etc., while meant to make sex more pleasurable for women, requires that men's behavior in obvious way also be considered. By the same token, the same conventional wisdom that often makes sex frustrating for women does the same for men also. So even with respect to those issues which clearly delineate certain kinds of sexual activities, we cannot avoid more general issues, nor can we escape the conclusion that even issues which appear to be of exclusive concern to women are at best primarily of such concern. Here we need only recall the banal truth embodied among other things in Hegel's discussion of the master-slave relation, that one's self-concept is inseparably related to the existence of other people and to the self-concepts of other people. So any improvement, even in the sexual activities and enjoyment of women, cannot proceed without corresponding changes in the role that men play in these activities. But there are even deeper reasons for concluding that the significant issues raised by feminism, particularly about sex and language, but also in other cases, are inseparable from more general questions about human liberation, social justice, etc. For what feminists, blacks, Chicanos, gays, third world persons, and other persons are up to amounts, I think, to a powerful assault on some of the most fundamental ideas, practices, and institutions in Western culture, ideas about human nature and morality, justice and equality, self-determination and community, and so on. It is only within this more general perspective that these movements can be correctly understood and evaluated. Among the general issues which are at stake, we may list the following as the most significant. First, issues concerning the concept of a person, the ideas of freedom, autonomy, non-coercive human relationships, and human possibility for choice and diversity. Again, these are the main philosophical issues raised by the feminist movement as I see it. Two, issues concerning social justice, equality, and community. Three, issues concerning the relationship between nature and convention, for example, in relation to social roles, biology, convention, knowledge, and morality, and so on. Now, in light of these issues, something more can be said about the potential conflict between those feminists whose only or main goal is increased political power and domination in both political and interpersonal relationships, and those whose main goal is to change the basic assumptions that underlie our personal and political relationships. Those who take the first goal seriously are not really questioning the legitimacy of our present assumptions about these relationships or the political and social structures and institutions which embody them. Instead, their main complaint is that there aren't enough women who benefit from these assumptions and practices. Since the model of human relationships in question is basically a Hobbesian one, that is, people are seen as egotistical, aggressive, amoral, and are driven by motives such as competition, one of the results of this, well, there were two main results of accepting the legitimacy of these assumptions. One of them is that the other, as seen as an inevitable threat to one's own self-interest, and of course then struggle and conflict and competition and domination are the guiding principles behind all human relationships. And the second implication of this Hobbesian view is that society has to be construed atomistically, that is, as composed of isolated individuals who are in basic conflict with one another. And the point I'm making here is that the political or ideological demand for more political power doesn't question these basic assumptions behind contemporary political institution, but indeed accepts them as legitimate and just demands a different distribution of those power relationships. Excuse me. Now, while I recognize that the attempt on the part of women to gain more political power is A, prima facie justified, and B, a possible short-range measure for bringing about more basic changes in our social and political relationships, I still think it is important to recognize the fact that the philosophical thrust of feminism, and this I think is ultimately how feminism contributes to the other radical movements I've mentioned, is on behalf of qualitatively new ways of understanding persons and political and interpersonal relationships, that is a non-Hobbesian, non-coercive, non-competitive model of human relationships, so that the political changes striven for will embody such conceptual changes. If this is correct, then the only reason for resisting any comparisons with other liberation movements on the part of some feminists must be ideological. That is, women see blacks, for example, as political competitors, and so on. And since the underlying assumptions of our current society are not questioned but accepted instead as legitimate, this ideological position is similar to that taken, for example, by a black who may not be against racial prejudice per se, but only against discrimination against blacks. It is just such a stance in this case that racists can use to play the game of divide and conquer by pitting blacks against Chicanos, poor whites against Puerto Ricans, etc. It is hard to believe that such a stance can be seriously accepted unless one's aim is purely political. But I hope that my discussion of the philosophical component of feminism belies the suggestion that this is what the feminist movement is really all about. I haven't finished yet, folks, I'm sorry. While none of the three sets of issues that I've raised, that is, issues about the concept of a person, issues about social justice, and issues about the relationship between nature and society, are exclusively the concern of women, it still might be true that the specific way in which they relate to the concerns of feminists are unique in some respect. In closing, I would like to suggest one way in which feminism makes a unique contribution to these general human concerns, one that I believe will benefit all of us. There are a number of ideals and virtues which we should arguably aspire to as persons, and several of these ideals may either be embodied in or suggested by feminists who discuss other issues. I should note here that I'm not trying to romanticize women in the way that Marx tried to romanticize the proletariat by claiming that in general women are more morally virtuous just because they're more oppressed. For instance, in attacking the ideal of the macho male, feminists are telling us something about the need for non-coercive human relationships, for the elimination of insecurity and role-playing, and so on. Such goals as these should not be looked upon merely as means for improving the status of women or equalizing men-women relationships, etc. They are rather general moral ideals which would affect all of our relationships, much as the macho male generally projects himself as an aggressor in all of his dealings, not just in his dealings with women. Sort of Heideggerian. Miss Celia? No, anyway. Given the assumption that one cannot separate one's basic self-understanding from the way one undertakes specific activities, we can learn a good deal about general moral questions by uncovering the ideals that lie behind the criticism of particular ways of approaching others and specific kinds of situations. Again, the analysis of the macho image being one such case. Insofar as this is true, there is a sense in which feminism can and does make a unique and hopefully a lasting contribution to our perennial quest for human progress. That's it, folks.
Talk about the difference between just political activity that accepts the structure as it is and tries to get
Yeah, I don't mean consciously, but I mean conceptually. Yeah.
different distribution of the goodies
Yeah.
Women as judges or covered all officials. What sort of contribution to political life do you see this philosophical component of feminism having potential for making? What sort of things do you see that might come to that?
Well, and a certain, well, at least historically, I think that as I said a little bit in the paper, that I think the basic model of human relationships, such as marriage and political relationships, is based upon something like Hobbes's theory of human nature, where individuals are seen as aggressive and inherently antagonistic and are driven by basic power relationships. And so, of course, the idea is that on this view, which of course is embodied in various assumptions, political and economic assumptions of capitalism and liberalism and so on, you get more or less a model of society based upon the analog with classical physics, where social actions are the result of forces which are characterized in terms of these power drives. Now, one of the more obvious implications of this is that the individual has to see the other person as at least a potential threat, since if you make these basic assumptions about human nature together with assumptions about the scarcity of resources, it's always possible, and in most cases more than just possible, that in pursuing my self-interest, I'm going to frustrate someone else's, and so they're going to try to prevent me from pursuing my own. So you have basically an antagonistic model of human relationships based upon the idea that one has to dominate, or at least have one's own self-interest fulfilled at the expense of someone else. So I think the basic model of interpersonal relationships and of political relationships to a large extent is affected by this, and of course role-playing and all of it. Now, it seems to me that, again, as a matter of logic, and not as a claim about the intentions of people, demanding a redistribution of power, demanding that women play more dominant roles in both interpersonal relationships, such as marriage and political relationships, must, as a matter of logic, accept as legitimate that existing model. And so it's more like the difference between a coup d'etat and a revolution. That is, you're just changing the actual distribution of the power relationships and not questioning the legitimacy of this basic way of looking at human beings and their relationships to one another. Now, again, I'm not sure if one has to be a Marxist in order to make this kind of criticism. Certainly not a Marxist, at least in any doctrinaire sense, although I think that Marx is right about certain philosophical points. But I guess ultimately then, what I'm saying is something like this, that the real issue is not who should dominate, but the issue as to whether or not the relationship between people, either at a personal level, say man-woman relationships, or a political level, should be one of domination at all. And it seems to me that women or feminists who take the ideological position I'm mentioning don't address themselves to that question at all, but accept the basic model of domination is okay, and are just really asking for a bigger piece of the pie, so to speak. And from that point of view, they're really, and again, this is another Marxist point, they're really accepting the same basic values of the oppressors, because you get something in Marx that the oppressed begin to interiorize the ideology of the oppressor. So, in demanding more political domination, or more domination in men-women relationships, again, from a logical point of view, this presupposes the tacit acceptance of the very same model of human relationships which women are ostensibly arguing against, that is, the model which is held by the class of oppressors. And I'm not sure what kind of specific, I mean, other than the obvious point about changing in some radical way the basic relationships, both political and personal in a society as a result of the acceptance of a new or a different kind of philosophical outlook about the basic structure of human behavior and about the basic connections between the development of oneself and the development of other people. You know, I'm not sure what kind of specific political proposals.
When you talk about the demand then for more political power, and I see your point, I do agree, I guess, but pragmatically speaking, what else can women who are feminists do, who have daughters, for instance, who don't want to get ripped off by the plus laws right now that really discriminate?
Well, this is why I think that the real answer is that, I mean, as a matter of short-range strategy, this kind of thing might eventually lead to qualitatively new social relationships. That is conceivably that changing particular social institutions might, after a period of time, result in sort of what Hegel called a change of quality from a change in quality. So I see, again, the dilemma being what you suggested, a very real practical one or ideological one or whatever you want to call it, and at least a long-range potential conflict between the justice of this demand and the fact that ultimately it might be that these kinds of short-range benefits for women would actually perpetuate the existing status quo to the detriment of both men and women. So it's a dilemma, partly maybe a philosophical one, but perhaps partly an ideological one, and I'm not sure. Obviously, I have no solutions or suggestions for it, and I agree with you that it's a real problem. So I'm not trying to dismiss the demands of women for more political power. Indeed, you know, I'm sympathetic to that, but I think that this is sort of a long-range dilemma. And I'm just not sure what to say about its resolution. So I agree with you. See, the ultimate, I suppose, the most basic argument, I suppose, that one could make here would again be that ultimately the very satisfaction of this short-range ideological goal would actually perpetuate rather than change the existing status quo. Because if more women did get political power, then the pressure for more basic social changes would not be made any longer, presumably, something like this. So it's a dilemma because on the one hand you have that, on the other hand you have the obvious injustice involved in the fact that even within the existing status quo, as bad as it is, there still are inequalities which could be changed without having to change the whole political structure. And in a way, this is sort of the problem that you get in a way in Marx too, I suppose. The general argument between people who advocate revolution and people who advocate evolution. I don't know what you make of this kind of situation.
Well, I hadn't thought of it in those terms before. If we were supporting those very institutions of protesting, but I don't see the alternative in the next 100 years.
Yeah, well, it may be that the dilemma is a false one because I think it's perfectly imaginable. In fact, I think to some extent history bears this out that that evolutionary changes do bring about radical change, and of course, this is why I think one of the assumptions that Marxists don't take as seriously as perhaps they ought to. That so the dilemma may not be between perpetuating the existing status quo and trying to engage in a large-scale revolution, but it may be that relatively small-scale, short-range changes might, in fact, have revolutionary consequences over a finite period of time. So at least theoretically, this might be the solution, although again, from the practical point of view, it may not be satisfying. I mean, take the analogous case of how long it took for the 1954 Supreme Court decision to be implemented. It's still not implemented. So, there's not much consolation in that philosophical argument for blacks who are worried now about having their children get a decent education.
How for women in the power structure, haven't you, by definition, changed the status quo? I listened to you talk about perpetuating the existing status quo, and it seems to me that the existing status quo is the male power structure. And is able.
Well, I don't know. Has the basic status quo changed if Ford rather than Nixon is in the White House?
It seems to me that is equivalent to the question I'm asking, that if you bring more women into the power structure, haven't you disorient, by definition, the status quo, and brought about a situation in which, at least within our society, the anthropologists no doubt come up with societies which have that.
No, because the essence of the essence of the power structure has nothing to do with who occupies the positions of power at any one time.
Do we know that? Since we've never had a power structure in the West that's occupied primarily by women.
Yeah, but that neglects the fact that there are certain constraints even on the people who are in the power structure, given existing laws and so on. So in other words, you might, well, of course, there's the problem there about I see what you're driving at,
And maybe this is something like we want to call evolution.
well, see, there are two issues. I mean, the question, I mean, obviously, since there never have been, at least in the West, the women who have occupied the main seats of power, you're dealing with a contrary to fact situation, which is difficult to say anything about. But I guess at least I'm partly basing my argument on the assumption that the power structure, in terms of whatever legal and political practices and institutions there are, is not essentially dependent for its definition and its continuance upon who happens to occupy those positions of power at any one time. So, but again, of course, the complication comes in the fact that the people who are in the power structure at least have the potential ability for changing parts of it, or at least for using it in ways which, while within the power structure, still are flexible enough to bring modifications about it. So, I mean, this could certainly come about. Now, I guess the other reply I want to make to this, and this sort of brings in a whole set of issues here, is that it's arguable, and again, part of my evidence for this is historical, that there are more affinities between, all right. There are more affinities between Gloria Steinem and Gerald Ford than there are between Gloria Steinem and my mother, right? Because the movement itself has an elite, and then it has the average rank and file woman, and it could very well be argued that the ideological outlook and the education, the background, and so on, and even the political goals of the leaders of labor union movements and feminist movements and so on are closer to that of the existing establishment than they are to the rank and file of their own movement. And you know, I think there's some truth to this, because I mean here my argument is not based upon the fact that, you know, Betty Friedan went to Radcliffe or whatever, but you know, what the vanguard of the proletariat, so to speak, thinks of as being in the interest of the proletariat, or as being progress in the direction of a revolution, or not, might have very little to do with the self-perceptions of the rank and file member of the movement. You know, just to give an outlandish example, I mean, you know, while most women might not give a damn, you know, whether Bob Walters is going to make $5 million, they would be more concerned, you know, with, say, whether or not they can get their husband to do the laundry once a week. Now, of course, from the point of view of somebody, I suppose, who's a member of the vanguard of the women's movement, you know, and I think this in part accounts for a split in the women's movement. The really important issues have nothing to do with how many women are on college faculties, you know, but whether or not the average woman can get her husband to get off of his behind and help with the, you know, change the kids. So, and of course, from the point of view of the, now of course, the reason why there's a conflict, or part of it, is because the woman might not, doesn't think there's anything wrong necessarily, I suppose, with being a housewife at least sometimes. So I mean, even aside from these particular questions, I think the general issue there is to what extent the elite or the leaders of a particular movement, like women's liberation, are closer in their philosophical and sociological and ideological orientation towards the analogous ruling class in some other group than they are to the rank and file of their own. I mean, you know, the example of labor union leaders is a perfect example of this. So I'm not sure how far you can press that kind of argument. Again, as you suggest, I think it would probably depend upon evidence which has not yet been forthcoming, for the simple reason that there haven't been enough women who have actually had power roles at the governmental level. That might provide some evidence for or against. And again, the same thing happened with, you know, how many radical blacks thought as little of Dr. King or you know, people like Roy Wilkins as they did of white leaders. I mean, this is one reason why I think Malcolm X and other radical black leaders were so popular, and maybe one reason why they were assassinated too, I don't know. So I don't know if you're satisfied with that. It's not much of an argument, it's just sort of the hint as to what might be involved in there. Does that make any sense?
I really threw it out. But I threw out the question first.
No, I think that, I think that for part of what you're saying, I agree with it, and I think that maybe I am being a little bit too quick here, but at least because there's really no evidence. So what I'm really doing is sort of reasoning by analogy, or at least on the basis of past experience, and it's not clear that how legitimate this is, because since most of the individuals whom these generalizations are based upon have been men, it may be that the analogical inferences to the claim that women in power will behave the same way is not legitimate, because you don't have a representative sample class. So I agree with that.
Relative view of it, what do you think that stems in terms of your discussion today?
Yeah, I,
They didn't intentionally who have written because they were professional.
What about Bill Hanson?
Well, I said most of them, yeah.
Well, I think most of them would qualify as feminists, probably.
Yeah, well, yeah, and as again, there are a number of prominent women who, I suppose, expressed some, but not much sympathy with feminism on the grounds that they were able to do it all themselves. And again, of course, this is a perfect example of the point that I'm making, and namely that sort of they conceive of themselves as the feminine analogs of Horatio Alger, right?
I think the first, a good example would be who you're talking about, someone like Anne or Ayn Rand. She completely divorces herself from it, but yet she's exactly what, she's there. So I suppose.
Yeah, yeah, unfortunately.
Right, right.
Well, let's see. I can't recall the name of the woman who coordinated this thing.
Oh, Mrs. Armstrong, is that her name?
Yes. And what I know of her and the other guys, she hardly qualified for
So in other words, what you're saying is, a matter of fact, the women who have really succeeded in an outstanding way in our society have been ones which have not criticized, but have actually made use of existing methods for social whatever you call it, upward mobility.
Well, look at two women in publishing, like Helen Warren Simmons, or better known as Helen Gurley Brown.
Yeah.
Now, this is in feminist.
Can we look at just the women in Iowa, for instance, who are our representatives? I think probably most of them are feminists. Roxanne Conlon, Lynette Gilbert. I don't think they divorced themselves from it at all, and I think.
No, I don't think those two have.
Well, there are others, Diane Grant, there are Republican women, Lipsky, I think they address themselves feminist issues.
Well, I think what the man I live with is trying to argue is something you learn, unfortunately, as you get older, and that is that for every Lynette Gilbert and for every Roxanne Conlon, there are at least 3 women who have made it up the ladder precisely because they've been selected out. And they adopt what we call the Queen Bee syndrome, or if you want to call it Horatio Alger. And, you know, it's a sad thing to have to admit. It often is unfortunate in our society.
And of course, there's a tendency to romanticize certain progress on the part of women and not others. I mean, the fact that there may be more women who work for the telephone company is not a big thing, but the fact that there are more women on college faculties or something like that. So again, I mean, I think this is part of the, you know, sort of like the old argument, you know, if blacks weren't impoverished and enslaved, you know, where would James Baldwin be? We'd never have him and all this kind of crap. So I think, I would suspect that on the part of at least some women who we would consider, quote, intellectuals, or at least women who are not just the average rank and file, would tend to have a much more jaundiced conception of what constitutes the goals of the movement and progress to some extent, although again, I'm not saying this is as a generalization, but certainly the kinds of the issues that, or at least part of the attention is given to issues or even to progress which might be of only marginal concern to the average woman, just as for the average black it might only be of marginal significance that Thurgood Marshall happens to be a black man. I think this is a problem that and perhaps is only implicit in what's transpired in terms of the women's movement up to now. But I mean, it potentially, I think it's it might have certain important ramifications. Oh, you mean those are problems that, that don't require political action?
Well, yes.
Yep.
Are you saying that the average rank and file woman's basic concern is getting her husband to do the laundry?
Well, I don't know. Well, you see, but again, the difficulty here is that the model of relationships between spouse and spouse rests upon precisely the same assumptions as the model of political relationships and social relationships. So it's, again, certainly as a matter of strategy, certainly the question about how two spouses divide up whatever chores they have to do is not, does not require political action, whereas other kinds of relationships do. But again, in terms of the attitudes that people have and the general way in which people see each other and their relationships to other people does involve some kind of change in basic philosophical modes of understanding. So certainly it's only natural that the focus should be on political issues which transcend, at least immediately, direct interpersonal relationships of that sort, and relate to, you know, changing social institutions. Is that what you were That's possible. That's probably not your fault, but.